I'll start letting the people in, Joe.
I was muted. Go for it.
Yep. Good morning.
Morning.
Hey, Frank. Long time no
Holy
see.
cow, Anthony, how are you?
Good. I haven't seen you in years, Frank.
I haven't seen you in decades. Not years, it's been decades, I think.
Feels like it's been decades. Yeah.
Oh, it's so good to see you, Anthony. I didn't realize you were going to be on this call.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. Long time, Frank. I don't know about
When Anthony,
that,
when Anthony was young, when Anthony and I were a young man, we went out almost by ourselves to California to pay homage to Governor Pataki at the time for his work in landing Semitech in New York State. And so we had he had a table of like for 10 people, and I think there were like 6 of us or 4 of us at the table, but it was all for a good cause, because look at the semiconductor industry as we have it today. You know, it really worked out for everyone's interest.
We had a trip or two to Germany, I think, too, Frank, didn't we?
Yes. Well, I had forgotten that you had come on those things. I had forgotten, Anthony.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
Central Hudson was a part of it. Yeah. So those are the good old days.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. Hi, Harold.
How you doing, guys? Thanks for doing this, Anthony.
Thanks for setting it up, and happy to do it and have a good conversation here.
Yeah, and we'll keep the recording. We'll make that available to folks as well.
Excellent.
It's starting to get real.
It is really starting to get real, and I know people are feeling the pricing impacts already and what's happening in the energy markets right now. It's pretty extraordinary, actually.
We've been trying to scare people for about we're at 18 months, but I think it's finally taken hold. Took Halloween 2022 to get people officially scared.
Yeah. I think you're right, Harold. So Harold, you're going to give me the go ahead when you think we can get started and what we want to do here. I don't know how many people you were expecting.
It looks like we have a decent turnout. Let's give it another minute or two. I think there might have been a little confusion with the link. Okay. So let's give it another moment, and then we'll turn it right over to you. I don't think we need to hold on to too many formalities here. It's a pretty familiar, friendly group.
Yeah.
Oh, I have Pat Flaherty. Speaking of semiconductors, hey, Pat.
Hey, everybody.
How you doing, Pat?
It's a double-edged sword. Give with one hand, take with the other.
Yeah, that's true. And we do use a lot of power, unfortunately.
You do.
Give it one more minute. I see one person hopped on. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Just on my end, just want to really thank Central Hudson for being such a great partner, in support of manufacturing and support of economic development. An original member of our association going back 112 years ago. So obviously great partners. This is interesting times that we are engaging in here. I think, I'm sure Anthony will get into this, but I think we all support a decarbonization and moving to a more sustainable energy future. I think what we're going to be talking about is this transition and what the challenges are in the current process and the current implementation of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or is that backwards? Whatever.
You had it right. Yeah, you had it right.
Yeah, let's go with that.
Climate Leadership and Community
Leadership, whatever, all those things.
Yep.
So I'm going to turn it over to Anthony to talk about this. We have a fairly small group. I think if we could, let's all mute for now. Let Anthony go. I'm sure I'll leave room at the end for questions, and we'll have a little conversation at the end. So appreciate that. And without further ado, Anthony Campigiorni.
Thanks, Harold. I appreciate it. In fact, for questions, we'll certainly leave time at the end, but, raise your hand or just speak up while I'm going through some of these points. Want to have a dialogue here. If we want to stop at one of the slides, feel free to do so. I also want to acknowledge some of my team on the call too, John Masurgeon, Joe Jenkins, and Jerry Nappy, all from our corporate communications department right now. And Harold, I appreciate you getting this together. We have been a long supporter of the council industry, more than a century now. But there's some interesting times. I think Harold said it before, things are starting to get real. There's a transition going on right now in energy, and the impacts are being felt. And they're mostly being felt on the cost side right now. And I think they're going to accelerate. And I just want to go through some of the things that are happening right now in New York State and maybe some of the impacts that you'll feel. So the first is, the law that was passed in 2019 is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And I'll refer to it as a CLCPA. You'll hear that. I mean, the goal is clear, right? It's really making New York a leader in emissions reductions, really trying to limit CO2 85% by 2050. And there's milestones along the way. And there's some really prescriptive measures. So, 6,000 megawatts of solar by 2025, 3,000 megawatts of battery storage by 2030, and 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. So there's very prescriptive measures in what the legislature put forth here and what they want to see happen. And so, there's targets that we need to hit. There's also some big milestones coming up. Well, one of them in another 7 years, we have to have 70% of our energy to be renewable. And you'll see a little bit later, we're quite a ways away from that. And we have a long way to go. By 2040, 100% of our generating sector needs to be emissions free. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Right now, after they passed the law, it was kind of nation leading. They set up a climate action council. This is a 22 member kind of advisory board. A lot of state heads of NYSERDA and DC are kind of the co-chairs of it, lead it. A lot of the economic development, Department of Labor, transportation are all on the Climate Action Council, and there are some appointees from elected officials as well on the Climate Action Council. Their real goal and their charge was to create a scoping plan, which is in draft status now, and deliver that to the governor by 2023 in January. So it's really putting forth how do we accelerate towards this emission-free renewable energy future that we have set forth in this legislative kind of bill that was written under CLCPA. Joe, you can go to the next one. So when we look at it, we're looking at the balance between the acceleration of decarbonization on the grid with both reliability and affordability. And I know both of those factors of reliability and affordability are going to be very important for many people, primarily guys like you, manufacturers. You have to have real high quality power, reliable, but it's got to be affordable. You compete in a global environment, and energy for some of you is a large part of your cost structure, and so it has to be affordable. One of the concerns we do have here at Central Hudson is if we don't have a federal policy and we don't even have a regional approach to it, Are we putting our businesses at a competitive disadvantage to perhaps neighboring states that don't sign on to some of these principles that New York has? And could that really cause some flight for us, for some of our manufacturing base and for some of our residents to move to neighboring states? So that's kind of one of the things that we are really concerned with. I think the other thing we are a little bit concerned with here is, we started a market structure. Central Hudson doesn't produce power. We were deregulated in 2000 when we sold our generating assets. There has been a market through the New York Independent System Operator that has sold power into the grid. We are now coming up with very prescriptive measures of what we want that generation mix to be, and we're now making out-of-market payments to get there. And is there an argument to be made that you're distorting the markets right now and maybe not pursuing lowest cost options? So we'll talk a little bit about that as well going forward. You can move on, Joe, to the next slide. So we all agree that we need to reduce emissions, but it has to be accomplished affordably. We have to make sure that we maintain the integrity of the grid. I think in the past, that's always been taken for granted, right? You've come home on a hot summer afternoon, you have the pool pump going, you want the AC on. We've never had, an occasion here where we said, you're not going to have power, we're going to have a rolling brownout for 2 hours. Now, California has, but across the world, we've been a leader with energy and not ever questioning that. We'll talk a little bit about the intermittency of renewables and what we need to couple that with to ensure that we have the integrity for a reliable system. And so we want to make sure we have that. We just want to also make sure that we're understanding some of the consequences. Again, I think elected officials had really best intentions at heart with passing this and reducing kind of emissions in New York State, but have they considered all the other things that and maybe unintended consequences that could occur, and considering some of the burdens it may put on people who have to implement this? And again, we'll talk about some of that going forward, because I'm not sure they fully realized the impact. And as we look at some of the initial cost studies, look, I'll be candid and everyone admits it, this is going to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The costs to implement are staggering. They are just staggering. There's no other way to put it. Next slide. So I think it is important to understand sources of emissions in New York and what the real targets are. So the generating sector has been, largely moved in a good kind of direction, in that carbon emissions have been reduced. All the coal plants in New York have been effectively shut down, moving to cleaner and cleaner fuel sources. The underlying theory here is clean up your generating sector, get that producing at the lowest emissions possible, and then electrify as many uses that you can that are more carbon intensive, right? And so the two big areas of opportunity right now for New York are transportation, right? Taking oil fuels and moving them to a cleaner electrification generating source. And then if you combine the residential heating with the commercial and industrial heating sectors, those are the two big real opportunity areas. We're going to continue to clean up the generating sector. By statute, we have to get cleaner and emissions free by 2040. But the two big areas that need to be attacked, or you really won't make a dent in the carbon emissions in New York, are going to be that transportation sector, where a third of carbon emissions are really from that. And then adding up the residential and commercial heating sectors, which makes up another 37%. So those are the two big pieces of the pie that you must go after right now in order to really make some meaningful difference in CO2 emissions in New York. You go to the next slide, Joe. I think it's also important to understand generating in New York. I would say as a state, we have a relatively, I would say, clean generating sector. More than 50% of it is kind of zero emissions right now. But New York State is very different. It's a tale of, the ISO tells this story, the New York Independent System Operator, which maintains the kind of the grid market. North and west of Albany, the sector is almost completely emissions free. And that's because they were blessed with great hydro, which has been really a legacy kind of resource up in Niagara Falls. They have several nuclear plants up there that are zero emissions, and they have the best kind of wind corridors. Downstate is almost exclusively fossil fuels, and as we shut down Indian Point, we saw a lot of effects from that, including you lost an emission-free resource, and we also saw really, especially in our zone where you guys are located, we saw prices really increase pretty dramatically after the closure of Indian Point, and that will go to the point of fuel diversity. But one of the things you need to understand about upstate and downstate in that dichotomy is that most of the power is used downstate, so it's the New York City, Long Island markets, but 2/3 of the power is kind of generated upstate. And so the ability to move those electrons from the clean emissions upstate to downstate is going to require additional transmission lines to be built, which are tough because those are going to be your 345, those tall structures that you might see along the thruway and others. Sometimes they, traditionally have been kind of lattice looking structures. They're going to be a little bit more streamlined, I think, going forward, but you're going to have to build transmission. And in order to get to this future, you're also going to have to build a lot of transmission offshore and then into Long Island and into New York City. As you guys can probably all appreciate, that is going to be no small feat to get major transmission into New York City from the ocean. There's going to be a lot of, I'm sure, objection to that. So there's a lot going on there. I would tell you the other issue of getting those electrons from upstate or offshore to downstate is going to involve a lot of costs too. And that's part of what's happening here is that moving these electrons from the cleaner emission to downstate. So downstate, when Indian Point closed, we saw costs go up. We did replace Indian Point's generating capacity, which was pretty robust at about 2,000 megawatts. With two large natural gas fire plants, one in Cricket Valley in Dover and one in Wawayanda in Orange County. Those kind of took the place of Indian Point as it shut down. And so carbon emissions downstate, quite candidly, have gone up pretty significantly because of those two power plants, right? But we needed it for the reliability. We could not do it without. We didn't have adequate transmission to move that upstate generation to the downstate load centers. We can move on, Joe. So we have some low and emission-free options, certainly renewables. You saw the prescriptive targets, 9,000 megawatts of wind, 6,000 of solar. Nuclear right now, we closed down Indian Point. As they close down Indian Point in New York State, they also have 3 upstate nuclear plants that they're subsidizing with something called ZECs, zero emission credits. And those are subsidies really to keep the nuclear operators in business, like to be candid. So those zero emission credits were really to say, if we close down the upstate nuclear plants, we're going to backslide further on our carbon emission reductions. And so New York State had agreed to a 12-year, $6 billion program from 2018 to 2030 to subsidize those 3 upstate nuclear plants to make sure they were still online and producing. And so right now, that's kind of the deal that the upstate nuclear has. So as we increase renewables, we want to keep the nuclear online. We have built more natural fired gas plants. We'll talk a little bit about that and how that goes hand in hand with some of these intermittent resources that we have with wind and solar. And then there's a whole, emerging field of clean fuels, probably led by hydrogen. Renewable natural gas has some utilization here in New York State. And then the storage systems, right? The holy grail, if we can get batteries cheaper, more ubiquitous, have greater duration, that could be really a game changer if we can get there. And certainly fuel cells. So, looking at emerging technologies is going to be important. And I will say one of the things we don't like about prescriptive measures is we don't want to think that the legislature in 2019, by passing this law, knew about all the technologies that may be developed. And if you let the markets develop and you put research and development behind some of these things, who knows what some of the game changers may be going forward. And one of the things we don't like about the draft scoping plan that has come out, they do have bans on certain technologies already. And we think it's a little bit premature to ban anything right now, because I think fuel diversity is something that has really benefited New York State over the years to try to keep prices reasonable, at least at the generating source. Go to the next slide. So we talk about availability of energy resources, and really the chart to the right is the New York average. So not all resources are created equally. I think sometimes in some circles, I know people think that solar is going to displace the need for some of this, what we will call baseload generation. And although solar certainly is a great resource, and it has a capacity factor about 14%. And so what that means is that sometimes it's not going to be there when you need it. And we have to be cognizant of those resources and when they're available. So nuclear, when it's on, it's shut down for maintenance, or else it's running and it's bidding into our grid system. You have some dispatchable resources that are quick startup. And again, natural gas is one of those ones that start up quickly. Within 10 minutes, the ISO can call on one of these plants to start up and fill a gap. So if the wind stops blowing or if the sun's going down, you need dispatchable resources that could start up quickly. Right now, the perfect complement to these intermittent renewables like wind and solar is quick dispatch generation. Like natural gas is the one that technology today that meets the need. And so I often think that people think as we build more solar, we're displacing the need for our existing generating sources, and we're not. It complements it. It certainly mitigates the amount we need to use, but we can't displace it completely today with the technologies available. And if you really want reliability, there is no way to say that there's a replacement of wind and solar for natural gas and nuclear right now. It just doesn't exist from a technology standpoint. And so we have to be cognizant of that right now. So I talked a little about renewables and intermittency. And so the point here is you need, as we go forward, and we're going to have a lot more wind and solar into the grid, you're going to have periods of time that we'll see that you won't get the generation that you were hoping for some of these resources. We know in the wintertime, solar has a lot less output. At evenings, it won't. And that's sometimes across the state. If you look at peak times when peak demand is happening in a lot of part of the state, not at the same time when the sun is at its peak. And so it's happening after hours, especially in New York City where the demand load is. Their peak is happening sometimes 7, 8 o'clock at night when solar's not producing. And so how do you fill that void? As you build solar, you still have to have a resource there to make sure they have reliability so the lights don't go out. And so when you look at these renewables, it's just the capacity factors of how much they run. So about 14% for solar, call it 30% for wind here right now in New York State. And so that's kind of the issue we're trying to deal with right now. And how do you fill those pockets and those voids when wind and solar won't be running? Go to the next slide, Joe. The other daunting thing here, I mentioned that we have to be 70% renewable by 2030. We were blessed with hydro, so we started about 20% renewable from a legacy system here in New York. We've spent, close to probably $20 billion in the last 20 years, and we've moved that from 20 to probably 28%, I guess, right now, where we are at renewable generation in New York State. We need to go from 28% to 70% in 7 years. We've moved the needle very little. There is more solar behind the meter at people's homes and businesses, but we have a long way to go. And when I say a long way to go, I mean a really long way to go. You'll see some of the figures on that graph. We're at 6,000 megawatts and where we need to go. I mean, this is going to require building about 35 large solar battery wind farms each year for the next 28 years. There's an incredible amount of work to do here. I think the state is recognizing some of the shortfall. I don't know what it means yet if we don't get there, but I know they're going to push hard to get there. So we just have to be cognizant. The other issue that's coming up in a lot of areas across the state is land use issues, right? And some of these large solar facilities might consume 30 or more acres with panels, and a lot of communities are opposing them. The state has set up its own siting office to try to help renewables get approvals, whether it's wind or solar. But the amount of land use and land mass that's being consumed by it is becoming more and more an issue for a lot of upstate communities where these are being built. So we have a long way to go. I think that's the point here. The state is committed, about 20 billion to meet some of the clean energy goals. This has largely been in electrifying some things with EVs, energy efficiency, some of the clean energy programs we currently have. Right now, about 10% of our bills are kind of clean energy, but those are going to get much larger. When you look at the cost that they put in the draft scoping plan, I think of almost $400 billion in the next 30 years. There's some estimates that that's off of a base case of $2 trillion, and that 400 billion was incremental off of the 2 trillion base. So we're still trying to get costs, and that's one of our concerns with this draft scoping plan. Trying to get real clarity on the costs and the benefits has not been easy. As we look forward, we're really worried about what this might do to customer costs. And as we look at all the costs, both on creating new resources as well as the build out that's necessary. So I talked about the build out of transmission that's going to have to happen from upstate to downstate and from offshore onto shore. If we electrify everything, there's substantial costs that we at Central Hudson are going to have to incur to build out the distribution system, right? I mean, we just don't have capacity everywhere if we're going to electrify all the heating sources at people's homes, all the vehicles and transportation networks. We're going to have to build out more substations, more circuits. That is going to cost money. There's some efforts, when you talk to Con Ed, they're saying just on electrification of some vehicles in some of the boroughs, that's like building several additional skyscrapers on a circuit. That's going to be an incredible cost to find the places where to do that, how to do that, the time to do that, and the money to do that is going to be incredible. And so there's estimates as we go from a summer peaking state to a winter peaking state, the amount of heating that needs to be built out, the amount of transportation, that the system could easily double or triple on the local distribution side and what you're going to need to handle all the capacity. Right now, I think the projections are that we go from a summer peaking state to a winter heating peaking state by 2035 to 38. So we don't have a long time to doing that. You got to start that planning, and some of that build out has to start occurring really soon to make sure people have the reliability that they're used to. Joe, you can go to the next slide. So as we try to talk to elected officials and even our customers, we've tried to come up with kind of 4 basic principles that we've, commented even in the public hearings with the state on, kind of 4 principles for our energy transition. The first is pretty much for us, we call it table stakes. It's required. The electrical power grid must meet your energy needs at all time. I don't think we're in a place where we're okay with, rolling brownouts, that you're not going to have the reliability you need when you need it, no matter when that is. And we have to make sure we build that system right, that intermittent renewables alone can't provide the necessary around-the-clock energy needed. I mean, it's clear right now in today's technology, you just can't do that. So we're saying kind of dispatchable baseload generation. You need to be able to dispatch things quickly. Right now, the technology that exists is natural gas. Batteries hopefully will get better. Right now, they're about a 4-hour capacity resource. We see in California, they have a lot of solar in California. During the day, they're in good shape. Solar is producing the vast majority of their power. They're using the batteries when people start coming home, and they start peaking when people start coming home. They're using the batteries in those 4 hours to offset the demand, to keep that peak kind of low at that time. And then at night, they need traditional generating resources to kind of fill the gap during nighttime hours there. So electrical power must, the grid must meet your need at all times. So reliability is huge. The second one is, New Yorkers' livelihoods must be enhanced and not harmed by this transition. And so, again, we worry if we don't take a federal or even a regional approach, that all these high energy costs in what is really a global problem, right? Carbon emissions. It's not a New York State problem. In fact, we're one of the least carbon intensive states per capita. It's really, is it going to harm the businesses and residents to really start leaving the state? We've seen an exodus in New York State for high taxes and other reasons. We want to make sure that people aren't leaving more so because of policies that we have here that are not being adhered to by other states and really causing harm to our residents and our businesses. And so we do really worry about that. And so livelihoods have to be enhanced and not harmed by this transition. Next slide, Joe. So the other one is, reducing emissions at the lowest possible cost. These were always kind of market-based principles that we've had in New York State historically, using NYSERDA through some of the auctions they had. But right now we're being very prescriptive in what we want to do. And sometimes you're not going to get the lowest cost possible in that. So we do have to make sure we're fully exhausting our lowest, most cost effective strategies first, to make sure we get there in the least cost and most efficient way. And so, for us, energy efficiency has always been one of the cheapest programs you can run to reduce some of that demand. So we want to make sure we're doing that. And I think principle 4 is one we really believe in, that all emission reduction solutions must be considered. Right now, the CLCPA is very prescriptive, calls out certain technologies they want. They're banning other technologies. But I think you got to let technology, develop. We can't pretend in 2022 we know all the technologies that will be developed. So banning things prematurely before we find maybe more efficient ways, carbon capture, other technologies, is a little premature. And I think one of the strengths that New York has always had has been fuel diversity. And as we close down one of the nuclear plants downstate, we've made ourselves more reliant on a single source of fuel, which is gas right now, natural gas. I don't think we want to do that going forward, to make ourselves really beholden to one source, whether it's wind or solar. We see countries like, if you look at Germany and what they've done, they really try to go in all renewable. They probably prematurely shut down their nuclear fleet. And then with the geopolitical events that happened in Russia, they were really caught short. And you guys probably know, on a kWh, a kilowatt hour basis, they were paying about 55 cents per kWh, which is extraordinary, which has put enormous pressure on their economy and some of their manufacturing base. We think, you need fuel diversity, and, reducing options this early and not letting technology develop is just the wrong move right now. Go ahead, Joe, you can move on. So that's just a quick overview. Happy to open up for discussions. So there is a draft scoping plan out there. We have additional resources that link through our website if you want to go to it. This draft scoping plan will be delivered to the governor in January. I think Harold said it well before. This is really starting to get real, and the impacts are starting to be felt. There are a lot of costs built into this plan. Now, I will say this. As part of the statutory, as part of the statute that was written in the legislation, there are a couple of, I would call them, exit ramps, and exit ramps to pull back a little bit from the plan. And the two primary ones are reliability, if reliability is being breached, and if they start seeing an enormous amount of kind of terminations and shutoffs because of high energy costs. And so I think they are mindful of those two things. But I think it is important, and Harold knows this because you guys have done a lot of it over the years. I think it's important, as you guys see energy costs going up and what's happening, to make sure your voice is heard. And I think on the next page, Joe, we have a list of elected officials, which Harold has probably a better list than us. But, make your voices heard. You guys are an important, critical industry for us. One of the things I'm really worried about this sector is that in the scoping plan, there is something called energy intensive trade impacted businesses. And when you take a look at businesses that have maybe a disproportionate costs related to energy, New York State almost acknowledges that those businesses will be shut down or moving out. I don't think that's a really good strategy for the state. And, as we look across, we had a consultant, Cadmus, do some analysis for us. There's a number of you, and there's a number of, firms in the Council of Industry that I think are going to be severely impacted by this law because of the percentage of energy you use in your business overall. So, it is a real concern, and it's really directly related to many of you in the Council of Industry. So I'll stop there. We will share the presentation, Harold, with you so you can get it out to your members. Happy to take questions and have a discussion if you'd like.
I always get to ask the first question. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, I maybe go back to the slides about your talking points and the 4 principles, but the alternate technologies and the not getting locked in. What are the ones that are proscribed? I mean, you mentioned that there are some things that are banned. Is nuclear one of them going forward, or?
Nuclear is not banned. We did shut down Indian Point. It is not banned. It's probably, depending on relicensing, is going to be an important part, I think, of the 2040 plan, Harold. It doesn't count in 2030 for being renewable. It does count in 2040 for being one of those zero emission resources they're looking for. So the issue right now with nuclear is the cost of the ZECs. So the ZECs, the zero emission credits that are getting paid to nuclear right now, run out in 2030. And the issue will become, we've seen Entergy and others pull out of this marketplace. Will they continue to operate is maybe part of the question, depending on how the market signals work, will dictate that. One of the things too with markets, so when we created markets here in New York and divested generation, one of the principles was to shift the risk from consumers back to those producers to let them invest the capital and to try to bid into a market with their product to see if it would be accepted. I think what we've seen over New York, to be very candid, is that we've moved away from these market principles. We've made a lot of out-of-market payments to technologies that we like. So you're paying for the reliability you need. Now we're paying for the policies we want. We've done that, but when people start to fail in New York, what we tend to do in this marketplace in electric generation is we privatize profits and we socialize the losses. So here's what typically happens in New York. So a generator is suffering upstate, and we know upstate has a long history of decline. Oftentimes that generator will come back and say, well, if I close, you're going to lose the 250 jobs at my plant, 80% of the school taxes. And what we often do in New York is we say, well, let's kind of bail them out. And now we'll socialize that cost across all customers in the state, and we'll help fund them. And essentially that's what's happened with nuclear. Nuclear came back and said, there's not enough money right now to be made. And we're saying, well, we can't afford to have you close from a carbon emissions reduction standpoint. And so all customers are going to pay these zero emission credits to make sure you have a baseline that you won't fall below, to make sure you can continue your operations. And so we kind of moved away from some of those market-based principles that we wanted, Harold, and we continue to subsidize things when things are in jeopardy. And so you're kind of bastardizing the markets. And now with making a lot of out-of-market payments for the policy initiatives you want, you're really creating some distortion in the markets. And so the New York Independent System Operator is trying to thread that needle and change some of the market rules to make sure we could kind of harmonize those two things that are happening right now.
And where does the capacity charge fit into that discussion? Because I mean, I know that was it was a few years ago now, but we seem to have gotten screwed by just being in the middle, here in the valley.
No, it's right. And so what Harold is referring to is capacity charge. Capacity charge literally to our zone added hundreds of $millions of cost. And the theory is that you have that available resource when you need it. And so the tension in New York was exactly this, was you have all this upstate generation, but you have all this downstate demand and you can't move it. It's bottlenecked. So if you think about a highway that only has 2 lanes and needs 6, that's what's happened. And so you couldn't move that energy, which was at the time, it's now 50-50 upstate, downstate, but at the time it was 2/3 upstate generating, but only 1/3 of the usage was upstate. So how do you get that power downstate? And we had congestion, and that's what capacity is. You're paying for congestion. What they wanted to do, knowing that they wanted to close Indian Point, is they needed to provide market signals for people to buy in the zone, that if you just existed in our zone, right, below that constraint line, you could then make money. And so they created a new capacity zone. It's new capacity factors here in the Hudson Valley. Those 2 gas plants benefited by those extra payments and were able to open up. And so the issue downstate is, if you have that constraint around Albany, where do you find available land to build to service the New York City market? And so that's been some of the constraints, and the capacity charges come here onto line. As we build more transmission, Harold, we've been making arguments of what's the exit ramp now? We knew what the on-ramp to capacity was, and it's cost us a lot. How do we get off of this capacity now? And there hasn't been a lot of contemplation of how you get out of the capacity as you build more transmission, interestingly enough, because I'm sure your financial models for these generators were built on securing capacity payments for some period of time.
Right. I could ask questions all day, but I can talk to Anthony pretty much anytime. So anybody else have questions? Want to hop in here? Just
Hey, Anthony,
unmute and talk.
Hey, Pat.
Hey, Anthony, it's Pat. A question on Hydro Quebec. I know for Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, they're doing a lot to bring in Hydro Quebec power across the border. Is that a viability for us in New York?
Yeah, I think it's a viability. It's been opposed by a lot. So you'll have independent power producers in New York. Gavin Donahue does a nice job that doesn't want out of state generation coming into New York State. There are proposals to get Canadian power, and there are some out there right now. One of the issues you have, though, I think with Hydro Quebec, we have to be careful of them. You know, a lot of people don't think about this, but I mentioned before, we're summer peaking, we're going to winter peaking. One, there's components of that that freeze up, so you don't have it. Two, Canada is winter peaking. And so you're going to be competing for that resource if we really go from summer to winter peaking. And so what it gives you might be a little bit more limited than we maybe initially first thought, right? That, oh, great, you just get all the hydro from Canada. I think there are plans to bring some hydro down from Canada. That will not benefit anyone in the Hudson Valley. Just to be clear, though, Pat, most of that is what they call DC, and it's going right into New York City. There's no exit ramps for that. It still helps because New York City is where the load is. But I think there are concerns about, is that supply going to give us as much as we think it will? And if we go winter peaking, we're going to be competing with the Canadians. And my understanding from the Canadians is a fair amount of that freezes up in the winter when we're going to have a strong need for it.
Thank you. You said, when do you think we switch over to winter peaking? Did you
I
say?
think the ISO's latest. Yeah, I think they had it at 2038 initially. I think they made, and Joe or somebody on the call, if you know better, I think they might have moved that back to 2035, but I thought I had initially seen 2038, but I was just on the phone with the ISO the other day. I think they said 2035. Now some of the new models are showing that we might be winter peaking sooner.
Thank you.
Anthony, this is Frank. Central Hudson has done 2 rounds of requests for proposals for battery storage in the Central Hudson utility system.
Yep.
But I know the first one was a no-go for any of the companies that provided proposals. And is New York State making that viable for you to actually go ahead in the next few years to actually start putting battery storage in? Because the reason why I ask is maybe a quarter mile from here by the mall that we have here in Kingston, there was a battery storage facility that actually got approved, went through all the zoning for the town of Ulster, and nothing's really happened other than they cleared some land. So what's holding those things up?
Yeah, and I think you're referring to Glide Path, Frank, up there
Right.
in Ulster County, and batteries have been a tough sell. And I think financially, Frank, I think the state recognizes they probably need to do more for it. The business model for them to exist isn't there. I don't think Glide Path has done much in more than 2 years now up there. And so we have to find other models to make sure, how does battery work? And so right now that arbitrage of just, selling energy when it's high and then replacing it when it's low is not enough in of itself to make a business case. And so I think if we're going to hit some of those milestones, Frank, we are going to have to incentivize the technology a little bit more. Getting an echo here, but one of the other things, Frank, that they're trying to do is the New York Independent System Operator change some of their capacity pricing to allow 4-hour resources. And this was really a nod to batteries to allow them to compete and get some dollars for capacity, right? So one of the issues with battery has been it's only a 4-hour resource. The ISO had, I think, initially would only take capacity resources that were 8 hours. And I think they've modified the rules to allow now 4-hour capacity resources to bid into the market and get payments. So I think that was one thing the markets have tried to do to augment payments. But I'm not an expert on batteries, Frank. I'm not an engineer either. So we have to do a lot more on batteries to incorporate them into the system. My understanding, though, the law of physics and everything else kind of limits right now what we can do. We're going to need some breakthroughs, I think, on battery technology, is my understanding still, to really get to that holy grail of what we need to store the power that we can generate during the day when the sun's out and storing it up for later hours and all day and all night. So we need to do more, Frank, is the short answer. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer than that. It is not anywhere near where New York needs or has in its milestones. Other questions?
Well, just a concern from us because everything you said makes it sound like the grid, if left unchecked, the grid's going to get more unstable. through time. Right?
I
If
think,
this didn't get ahead of itself.
yeah, I think if you read all the independent system operator reports, they worry about that, right? The intermittency of these renewables is concerning, and right, and so they have to make sure. Like you'll even see, DEC is going to be a major regulator of what gets approved going forward on all generating sources. Even these small peakers, which are pretty polluting, will only run for a short time in New York City. Removing them from the system without a backup is really concerning. You'll see that there's times where New York City this summer absolutely needed them. You look at our service territory, Roaston and Dansgamer ran in July a lot. We actually set all-time natural gas highs. We've always been kind of a peaker for natural gas in the winter during the heating season. We established a new record for our service territory this summer because of Dansgamer and Roaston. We needed those plants to run for the heat waves we had this summer. And so, instability is one, reliability is certainly our chief concern. And for sure, Pat, the other thing is we're seeing it. I've never seen this. I mean, the price spikes. I mean, our typical residential now for October is paying 17 cents a kilowatt hour just on the energy side. Couple that with our delivery charge of about 8 cents. That's astronomical. 17 cents would have been a really high in the last decade for a winter January price. The fact that it's happening in October causes us pause here. We are really bracing for what could be, and we saw prices spike over 20 cents last February, which was enormous for residential customers. I mean, we were having customers call saying, something's got to be wrong with my bill. I usually get $300, but a typical $300 bill, a 12-month rolling average would be less than 6 cents, went to 22. That $300 bill, just because of supply costs, went up to almost $700 in that 1 month. That's extraordinary. And, customers aren't ready for that. And, we hedge a fair amount of our portfolio in the winter peaking months of December and January and February, and some of the summer peaking months. I mean, we were buying hedges a little more than a month ago at 15.5 cents. And we would normally buy those hedges probably in the 4 to 5 cent range. I mean, we're buying hedges that were extraordinarily high. It's concerning. There's no question about it.
Yeah, that's why your conversation about batteries, if that technology could pick up, right? Because I don't know if the batteries will make the grid more reliable or less reliable, but the hope would be that it could be more reliable, and then you smooth out the renewables, and then hopefully get something under control from a cost standpoint. But
Right.
like you said, it's just not there yet.
It's not.
Other questions? I'm saying to be jumping in here.
Did you unmute? You have to unmute.
Any questions?
I don't hear you.
Kind of hear you low, Harold. I think you're just asking if there's any
I'm
more
sorry.
questions right now.
Any questions?
It's really weird.
Peter, did you have something you wanted to ask? Peter Ahrens?
I don't.
Yep. Okay.
So
All right.
if
Yeah,
there's
go
no more
ahead.
questions, then I appreciate everyone's time. We will send the presentation around, Harold, so you could share it if they want. We're happy to talk to more groups if somebody wants to talk a little bit more. If there's specific questions on technologies, we can certainly get more people here at Central Hudson involved if you have other questions that we can help with.
Thank you, Anthony, and we appreciate your time here and presentation. Anybody have questions, you can shoot them through me to Anthony or Jerry or John at Central Hudson. And we also, John, Jerry, if we get a copy of the video, we'll get it up on our website as well for our members. Thanks.
Great.
Have a good day,
Thanks,
everybody.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.